Good morning. My name is Philip Kufeldt, and I am a Seagate research technologist. I've been focused on computational storage for well over the last 2 years, and I've been presenting on computational storage for that long. And I have been working with Cruz and the Cruz Symposium for those 2 years, and I have done multiple presentations for them as well. But I figured this year it was time for me to show some of my work and some real world examples instead of just talking about computational storage. So the agenda today is going to be to give some background on the Human Cell Atlas project, which is a project trying to decipher cell mechanics through sequencing and data analysis. Seagate has been working with the UCSC on the Human Cell Atlas program now for about 2 years, and I'm going to use that data set and that problem set as an example for a live demo. I'm going to do a simple example as to minimize my tempting of the demo gods. I'm going to do just a rudimentary data query and data ETL from ACA, but it's a much more complex problem, and we're just going to show a very simple version of it. And we're going to use a real computational storage device to do that. Let's start talking about some background. I'm not a biologist, so I'm a computer scientist. So if I say anything wrong here, my apologies ahead of time, but I'm just trying to give some background so you understand why the data looks the way it does. And it's also kind of fascinating. It's fascinating to me, at least. We've been sequencing DNA since the early 2000s. The cost and time to sequence have plummeted over the last 20 years. That's why you can go to 23andMe and get your DNA sequenced for $100. But we use DNA sequences as a basis for precision medicine today. We've been comparing DNA sequences from one human to the next for so many years now. We see lots of variances, and those variances usually correlate directly to some sort of disease. So we can determine various types of cancer, and then we can target gene therapies, or not gene therapies, but therapies for particular cancer types or gene variances. But this is only looking at the blueprint of life. This is not how that blueprint is used and how the disease manifests itself in mechanics of the cell running awry. We still don't understand the cell mechanics. And so we need to understand how this blueprint is put into action in the cell to better understand disease and what are the mechanics of disease. So it turns out we can sequence more than just DNA. We can also sequence RNA. And what is RNA? RNA is a subset of DNA that is copied and clipped off of the of your main DNA and then sent outside the nucleus, where it's grabbed by a ribosome, and it acts as a blueprint for creating a brand new protein. And so every time that your cell needs to do something like divide or repair itself or create energy, it's going to have to create proteins to do this. So it uses RNA sequences to create those proteins necessary for the mechanics of the cell. And it turns out there's a one-to-one relationship between the RNA sequence and the protein it produces. This is called gene expression, DNA to RNA to protein. And at any given time, there can be many of these RNA sequences floating around the cell. That set of sequences is going to be different per tissue type. In other words, blood cells are going to have a different set of proteins they use than, let's say, bone cells or brain cells. Even location can impact the sequences that are going to be inside the cell. The shape of our organs is dictated by how proteins fold and bend around each other. So I will produce one set of proteins at a corner of my stomach and another set of proteins at the bottom of my stomach. So even for the same tissue type, there can be different sequences per location, also across the life cycle of the cell, from the beginning, from when it first is created till the time that it dies. There's going to be different sequences that show up. And there can be multiple copies of the same sequence inside of a cell. I may be producing multiple copies of the same protein for various reasons. And it turns out we can sequence these. In the last 5 years, we have created something called single cell sequencing that allows us to separate out one cell and grab onto all the RNA sequences and sequence them. It's fascinating stuff. I encourage you to go look at it at some time if you're interested. It's an amazing set of technology. And it's important to understand these RNA sequences and these genes because this is going to give us the indication of, you know, the cell mechanics across the life cycle of the cell. If we collect enough cells and sample enough cells from all the different tissue types, we can see hopefully a statistically relevant set of all of the life cycle activities that are going on in a cell, right? You know, if I were to only look at one cell, I would get a snapshot in time of that cell's behavior. So kind of like this picture of a strawberry, if I were to snip off the blossom, I would only see that one part of the strawberry's life cycle. I wouldn't see the fully healthy fruit at the end. I need to sample strawberries all the way through their life cycle many, many times to get enough statistical relevant data to know that this is the complete life cycle of a strawberry. Same thing with human cells. So I'm going to be sampling billions of cells. Well, how big is a sample going to yield? Well, there are currently 25,000 identified unique RNA sequences. So you can think of a single cell yielding one vector that's 25,000 elements long, each element being how many times that one particular RNA sequence showed up in the cell. So out of 25,000, you know, sequence 1 appeared 16 times, sequence 10 appeared 20 times. So I have a big long vector and I put them all in a matrix and I now suddenly have a big data problem, right? 1 billion cells with 25K features, that's 100 terabytes of just, you know, a vector full of, you know, ints, for example. By the time I get to 10 billion cells, I'm at a petabyte. If the number of unique RNA sequences goes up to 60,000, which some people believe could be the case, I'm now at a 2.4 petabyte data set. So big data problem. The Human Cell Atlas program, the geneticists want to be able to do full data set scans fairly frequently. They want to be able to take new tissue samples and say, this is what this one looks like. How does that compare to these other ones? So I want to be able to find all of the liver cells and then look for liver cells that look like the cell that I have. And to do that, I have to do a full data set scan. I mean, there are ways to segregate and do the data layout differently, but right now the full data set scans is what they want to do. Data reorganization may be necessary as the science evolves. So as the questions change and they want to be able to look at the data certain ways and different ways with differing metadata being attached to cell samples, the data reorganization is going to be necessary. So we want to use computational storage to offload these scans and indexing and reorganizations. We want to use Apache Arrow as the data layout. We've already seen several presentations so far this week where Apache Arrow is really just the tool set of choice for large data set problems like this. And then for distributing the data across many, many drives, Ceph, right? That's where we want to distribute an object store across many, many drives and get good balanced distribution. And then we want to utilize Skyhook to distribute the compute, but not only to OSDs, we want Skyhook to recognize that it may have a computationally enhanced hard drive and that it can push that even further and closer to the data and not have to transfer the data outside of the hard drive. And then we want to integrate Skyhook into the geneticist tools of Python and R to make Skyhook look completely transparent. So we're going to do a live demo, and the live demo is going to be a highly simplified demo. It's going to use a very simplified data set, and it's going to only use a single computational storage key value hard drive. We're going to show ETL. We're going to show loading a simple HEA data set into the key value store as arrow row partitions. And then we're going to demo an arrow query that runs on both the host and the drive. So this is kind of a view of the way you can think of the demo. We have a host sitting across the network from the drive. The drive is a network drive. It speaks TCP/IP. And to do this, it has a small PCB that's added to the front of the drive called an interposer that converts between network and the backend SATA 3. And it does this with computational resources that can be made available for other purposes. The demo goals, I want to show the value of using the same I/O model in and out. We're using a key value drive because it gives us the ability to write applications on the host that speak key value to the drive. And then we can also take and write programs for the drive that also speak key value, which means we don't have any layer transgressions. The same way I do I/O on the host is the same way I do I/O in the drive, utilizing the same authentication and authorization mechanisms. Want to show the value of using the same programming model in and out of the drives. And we want to leverage open source. So if I write a program for the host, I want that program to run inside the drive so that I can use the same program in or outside of the drive. And that is important because of maybe the drive's too busy to do what I've asked it right now, and I want to push back and have that same code run on the host instead of on the drive. Then finally, I want to show the possible data transfer reductions. This is the physical hardware that I'm going to be using. This is what you're going to see in the demo. We got a hard drive over here. We have the interposer card here. And then we have a little piece of equipment that allows me to do this on the bench or right next to me as I do the demo. This is called a T card. It just basically converts the signals on these pins to Ethernet and accepts power to power the drive in the card. So let's get on to the demo. Fingers crossed. Hello.
Very cool devices.
So can you give me control to share the screen? All right. And let's see if I can get this done in the amount of time we have. Before I get started, though, I want to thank all the participants in the HCA. This is a large research group. There's two principal investigators, one from CS and one from the Genomics Institute. There's Peter Alvaro, who's leading the CS side, and Josh Stewart, who's leading the genomics side. And we have a couple of great students in Bianca Zhu, who's doing all of the genetic experimentation and providing us with the example of what science experiments they want to run and how do we use her code to instrument with this computational storage. And then Aldrin Montana, who is the data wizard who does all of the Arrow work and is working on his PhD on programmable storage and being able to do these dynamic relayouts on the fly. So this is going to be a combination of sort of all of our work right now. Really quickly, let's look just to show you. This is the best I can do to show you that this is a live demo. This is the actual drive that I'm, and everybody, can you see this yet? Have I shared this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the drive. This is the interposer card that I talked about here, and this is the T card. And this is up and running right now. And that's what I'm going to be doing all of the demo on. The first half of this demo is really introducing the key value drive so you understand what the commands are and that I'm running and demonstrating. And then we'll see a handful of arrow commands that combine the key value drive with Apache Arrow. So let's start with the key value drive. The key value drive is a drive that is speaking Kinetic. Kinetic is an old protocol that was introduced about 6 or 7 years ago. It is now just kind of a research tool. There's nobody producing Kinetic drives right now, but we use it as a research tool, and it's a TCP/IP protocol that allows you to do gets and puts to the drive to store data. And we have a little utility called Kinetic Control, or KCTL, that allows you to be a client with Kinetic, and it allows you to essentially do all of the commands that Kinetic provides. Like I can do gets, and I can do puts and deletes, and I can look at ranges of keys. I can look at the key space using the range command. I can also do exec, which is what allows me to do computational storage. And we're going to talk more about that later on. The command requires you to pass it a host so that it knows which host on the network I'm going to be talking to. So in this demo, you're going to see me type NAT. That's the name of my drive. I'm going to be using the default port, so I won't be giving that as a command line. I can also do secure or non-secure connections. If I want to use TLS and encrypt the entire communication path between the two, host and drive, I can do that. But here's the other key point is I'm going to be using the default ID and password. So I'm going to be using ID1 and this goofy password here, but I could be using any user ID that I've defined. And that's what the ACL component of Kinetic allows you to do. It allows you to define other users and specify what they can and can't do. So I could define a user that could only get data, right? So I could create a read-only user that's not allowed to put data. I could create a user that's only allowed to get keys that are prefixed with the letter A, for example. So I can control his access to the key spaces and key ranges on the drive. And that's important because that allows me, if I had multiple computational storage users, I could, through prudent ACL definitions, create different places for them to be able to access and create walls between them such that they can't see each other's data, for example. And this is going to be true from the host perspective, but it's also going to be true in the drive's perspective. So I'm going to get the same authentication authorization scheme whether I'm in the drive or out of the drive, which I think is an important thing for computational storage. So let's go ahead and take a quick look and see if the drive is active. I'm hoping it's active. And it is. So I can do a handful of pings and I can do those, using the secure socket layer or not, doesn't matter. But the drive is active and up and running. I can look at the contents of the drive by doing a range call, and without any parameters, it should show me all of the key values that are in the drive. And right now the drive is empty. And so I can put a key value. So I'm going to create a key called Philip, and I'm going to, just say hello world. And now if I do the range call, I'll see I have a key called Philip. And if I want to, get that key, I just type it in and say get it, and it shows me my key value. I can also, with KCTL, allows me to put the contents of a file. So if I want to put the contents of the FS tab from this system into a key value, key.fs tab, I could do that. But the key space is completely arbitrary. It's free form. I can put ASCII or binary data as keys. Same thing with value. Anything is possible, but we'll just call it FS tab for now. And then I can go and get that key. And it shows me the contents of my FS tab, right? So I just put a copy of a file as a key value. All right. I can delete as well. I can say, that key, I can delete it. Yep, get rid of it. And now if I do a range call, there won't be an FS tab anymore. It's gone. Now, let me show you one other kind of important aspect of the key value database. I'm going to create a whole bunch of handful of keys here. I'm going to create key I, D, B, F, A, just a handful of single letter keys. I didn't do them in order, right? They're not in order, but the key value database is an in order database. It keeps them always in order, which allows me to do things like, I can look at particular ranges. I can say, show me all the keys that start with B and end with G. And provided I give it the right flags. I had to say start. So there's all the keys between that range, and I can do it inclusive or not inclusive. So give me all the keys between B and G, but not inclusive of G. And I can also use that to delete ranges of keys. So I can do, functions of. And so now if I look at that same range again, oh, I already deleted that. If I do that again, it's empty. And if I look at the whole range, I see that those keys are now missing. All right, so let's now start into the arrow portion of the demo. Let's look at the data first that I'm gonna, this is a sample TSV file that was given to us by the Genomics Institute. Very simple text format, tab delimited. So it tells you the gene name, the name of the cell that it came from. So this is the cell sample. And it says that there were 3 copies of that gene in that cell. And as you go through the data, you see we start seeing other genes. And for example, MTCO2, it's also from the same cell, and there are 59 counts of that in there. So what I want to do is I want to load that into the key value drive, and we have a little program called Skyload that will do that for us. So Skyload takes the name of the kinetic host off of the environment, not off the command line, and it's going to take the contents of that file, and it's going to create key values that have a base key of gene counts. And after it partitions up all of the data into arrow format, it will essentially create key values with this base key, and it's going to try to do it in groups of about 1 megabyte at a time. So now if I look at the range, you're going to see I have a bunch of key values created here. And this is essentially all of that TSV data as key value pairs. We have one, if you'll notice at the top there, that there's a key without a semicolon on it. That is the metadata key that describes the data. So I can look at that key value by using a skyread command. And so what skyread is going to do is it's going to go out and issue the key value get operation to get this key value, and then it's going to interpret using arrow what's in the contents of that file. So you can see there's no data in it, but here is the metadata of it. Let me actually look at the metadata. Let's do the M instead of the data. This will show me just the metadata. It shows me the schema from arrow, right? So I've got a column called gene name, I got a column called cell ID, and I got a column called expression count, which is just the integer. And you can see that there are 208 partitions in this data set. So, and that correlates to the key value space, or the key namespace. So if I do a range and grep for key 207, which should be the last key, right? Because there's 208, 0 starting the count. I see that there is a key value called 207. There's not one 208, right? So we have 208 key values that all hold a partition of the data. And I can go look at one of those key value data pieces here. So let's look at the metadata for this. And as we know that when you get row partitions with the arrow, it keeps the metadata with the key value. So I have the schema built into the key. So every partition in here, every key value has enough information for it to understand and interpret the data that's inside of it. And then I can look at the actual contents of the data by doing this. And we see that there are roughly 19,000 rows in here. And here are the first 10 gene names, the first 10 cell IDs, and the first 10 expression values. Okay, so now let's do a query of that data. So let me grab the command line here. It's a little bit long of a command line. So I'm going to go to NAT, and I'm going to issue a SkySQL. I'm going to run the SkySQL here locally on the host. The result is going to go into this key value pair. And this is the pseudo SQL statement that I want executed, right? I want to select star from gene counts. That tells me that the base key to use for looking for all of the data. And then I want to find where gene name equals pack4. Luckily, there was a gene that was my initials, so that's what we used. Notice that I had to read in 171 megabytes of data to do that, right? I had to actually read in all of those key values, all 208 of them, and issue that query against each one of those partitions to get the data. And so now if I do a KCTL range, I'm going to see I've got a couple of new keys here. I've got result host and result another one. So let's go look at result host. And you'll see that it's got the, again, we stored it as an arrow set. The results are also encoded with as arrow partitions, and it's only got one key value that has its data in it. So that would be 0, and then I can look at the data. And I also want to tell how many bytes I transferred for this. All right. So we can see we found 4,750 matches, and you can see all of them match. We only see the first 10 being displayed. But if I do grep pack4 from the original data set, pipe it to word count minus L, I see that there were 4,700 matches. So my SQL statement worked. I found those 4,750 pack4 genes throughout the entire data set. All right. So now let's do this via computational storage. So remember, we took the contents of a file and we stored it as a key value. Well, we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to use the binary, the SQL binary that we just issued on the host. I'm going to store that as a key value. So that's now on the drive, and I can show you that they're the same. So this is me getting the SQL key and running MD5 sum on it, and then doing an MD5 sum on the local file. They are the identical file. And it's only because the architecture of my host and the architecture of the drive are the same that I can do this. But I can now run that same SQL program on the drive itself. And I'm going to do that with a KCTL command. I'm going to say go to NAT and exec this key value. So it's going to load the contents of this key value. And then the rest of this is just the same command line parameters that I issued on the host. And so, but that's all going to run on the drive itself. And I'm going to store it in a different location. I'm going to store it as result.drive. So if I do a KCTL minus host NAT, sorry about that, range, I see I've got a new key value set here, right? And so I can now look at the results from that drive. And it's the same results we got from running it on the host. The exact same results, 4750, all pack4s. And we only transferred 189 kilobytes. The original call that we did, the original KCTL call didn't transfer any data. This didn't transfer anything. It was just a remote procedure call to run the program. So there was no data transferred here. And there was only 189K when we did the get to get that data. So we went from 170 megabytes of data transfer down to 189, right? Because this time we only transferred the results and not the entire data set as part of it. So that's sort of the data reduction. But you can see the power of being able to leverage that open source with the key value drive, that I can use the exact same arrow code that is compiled for the drive to run on the drive as I do on the host. So, you know, it doesn't matter where it runs, it just changes how much data is transferred on the network. And that's the demo. Any questions?
Thanks so much for the awesome demonstration. Any questions from the audience? I actually have some questions.
I had one. Can I ask, the partitioning that you're doing, is that being done by Arrow, or is that something that you're doing?
I think that's using the Arrow library, but it's being done as part of the Skyload, as part of the ETL.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, more specifically, we are splitting the data, but we're using Arrow functions to like, you know, manage the actual splitting, right? We're doing doing it logically.
So when you say the data is stored in arrow format, what kind of format are you using? The
I think we're using the feather format, right?
feather
It's
format.
Yeah. So we're basically using the feather format. We're actually using IPC, but feather is IPC, but with
Mhm.
compression, whereas IPC doesn't require a certain compression. But it would be the same if you use snappy compression with IPC, then it's exactly the feather format.
Is there any reason you choose to use the feather IPC instead of Parquet? Because usually the arrow from the arrow community says the Parquet file usually for stored data for long-term storage, but feather is usually for the storage for short-term. It's not. So this is the official documentation says. But is there any reason for you to choose the feather instead of the other format?
From my standpoint, it's one less translation that we have to do because we can actually the programs that look and examine the data already understand the feather format, and it's natural to store that as a key value. I'm not managing blocks, and that's kind of what Parquet is doing for me, right? Is I'm managing a set of blocks on the drive. And because key value is already doing that for me, it doesn't seem to me like there's a lot of intrinsic value in the Parquet format with key value.
There's one extra thing to add, which is that Parquet kind of assumes that you have a byte layout, right? So the layout of the data and the footer is so that, you know, because it makes it easier that when you add data, you can update the footer better. But like with a key value interface, some of those optimizations just aren't even that optimal.
I see. And so for the performance thing, I can see that there is a significant data reduction benefit from here. Have you measured some of the latency performance differences between and?
Not yet. Not yet. We're still getting the functional pieces together. And right now, what we're doing in the actual HEA is we have a R script from Bianca, who is actually doing some analysis of genetic information. And what we're doing is behind the scenes, we're completely instrumenting it to use computational storage, right? So we're right now trying to get that functional so that she has a set of tools that she can write experiments that use computational storage. And then we'll begin to do some of the performance comparisons once we get that done. We're going to do a data transfer first comparison, but then we'll start looking at performance. And ultimately, we have to get this, scaled out with Ceph and Skyhook, right? This was no Ceph or Skyhook was in this demo. So there's still a lot of work ahead of us.
I'm really looking forward to that because ultimately the performance is the thing we are chasing with. And
so that's I would say that's true and not true at the same time. There are use cases where even if individual queries on the drive don't perform as well as they do on the host, as you scale it out, you may get overall benefits, but there's also use cases where things that you just want to happen in the background while you're doing other things on your hosts up at the top. So you're freeing up resources and utilization, maybe at a cost of performance, but it's still valuable in the sense that you're freeing up those resources to do other things.
Yeah, this is very true.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. If there's no other questions from the audience, so our next speaker is from Sandia National Lab, Craig Almer. And Almer, I know you're there. Would you like to introduce yourself for me?
Yeah, hi. I'm Craig Ulmer from Sandia National Labs. I realized after I sent in the video that I didn't bother to introduce myself in the video. So, so yeah, I work at Sandia. I've been there since 2003, and I do a lot of different types of data problems, usually HPC, I/O kinds of problems, but also things where we go out and collect large data sets in the field from big science kind of experiments. And so, yeah, that kind of covers a lot of the background of what we're interested in. So we're relatively new, or I'm relatively new to Cross. This was our first year with the SmartNICs project. And it's been interesting, and I'll just, to set the stage of things, this is sort of a new area. This is, basically getting the scaffolding and everything up and running for doing some research with SmartNICs, and set expectations low for the performance of these cards, or the sort of the first generation or second generation of these cards. But we do see a roadmap for these things, panning out in the near future. So yeah, I guess that's it. Do you want to start the video? Hello, this is Craig Ulmer from Sandia National Labs, and this talk is on leveraging SmartNICs in data management tasks for high-performance computing. This is a project sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy under the Office of Science, and is in collaboration with Carlos Malton and Jianshen Liu at the University of California, Santa Cruz. This talk is about Eusocial devices in the network fabric. The availability of low-cost embedded processors has made it possible for vendors to insert programmable resources in nearly every place in the system architecture. As researchers, we are interested in applying Eusocial methods to leverage these processors with the idea that many hands make light work. The first place where Eusocial methods have had some impact is in the storage layer. Programmable hard drives and extensions to file systems have enabled us to push filtering and transformation operations as close to the disk as possible and improve system performance. Another area where we see the potential use of Eusocial methods is in the network fabric. Recently, network vendors have introduced new Smart Network Interface cards, or SmartNICs, that feature embedded hardware that can be used to inspect and process data as it moves through the network. The problem space that I am interested in is high-performance computing simulation workflows. These applications generate far more data than we can possibly write to disk. Therefore, there is great interest in analyzing the data as it migrates between the memory spaces of different applications in a workflow. In this talk, I will discuss our work in adapting the Feodel data management library to work with SmartNICs. This work establishes a communication environment that we will be using in the upcoming years for Eusocial network research. First, though, I think it's important to provide some more context about why we might care about Eusocial devices in scientific computing. In high-performance computing, scientists run massively parallel simulations to answer difficult research questions. One of the challenges in this field is that the runtime datasets are simply too large to store to disk. For example, applications running on modern HPC platforms may involve thousands of compute nodes and leverage multiple petabytes of memory. Given that it is time-consuming to rerun a simulation, there is a great deal of interest in coupling different analysis tools to a simulation to harvest information from the runtime data. As illustrated in the bottom left, a modern workflow may involve multiple parallel applications that exchange data at different points in time. In this example, the workflow first launches a low-fidelity simulation to warm up a dataset and locate interesting events. Some researchers attach deep learning tools to build models from the simulation's data and make predictions about what will happen in later time steps. The workflow may choose to launch a higher fidelity version of the simulation to investigate key events in greater details. Finally, in-situ analysis and viz jobs are connected to the simulation to summarize data and generate imagery for scientists to interpret after the workflow completes. The figure on the right shows how these parallel jobs are mapped to the compute nodes of an HPC platform. As this diagram shows, data management services are used to move data between jobs and cache data to improve asynchronous data flow through the platform. The HPC community has implemented multiple data management libraries for routing data between parallel applications in a workflow. These libraries include Dataspaces, Mochi, Conduit, and Feodel. These libraries typically implement distributed memory services on a collection of compute nodes, and then use remote DMA methods and event-driven semantics to move objects between jobs. One criticism of this approach is that services consume resources in the platform. In the simulation nodes, we steal compute cycles and memory from the simulation to transfer data out of the job. In memory pool nodes, we use the world's most expensive computing hardware simply to hold data in memory. As researchers and system architects, we ask, How can we insert cheaper memory pools into our architecture? And how can we create a better environment for in-transit computations? One possible solution we see to these problems is the use of SmartNICs. SmartNICs are network interface cards that feature user-programmable resources such as embedded processors, DRAM, non-volatile memory, and hardware accelerators. SmartNICs are not a new idea, but recently we've seen renewed interest in their use by industry because cloud computing companies need programmable NICs that can add a layer of protection between user VMs and the network infrastructure. There are multiple hardware vendors that are producing SmartNICs, including NVIDIA, Fungible, Intel, and Xilinx. Of these companies, NVIDIA's BlueField hardware is especially appealing to HPC users because it supports both Ethernet and InfiniBand network fabrics. The current generation of BlueField SmartNICs features 8 ARM processor cores, 16 gigabytes of RAM, 16 gigabytes of eMMC storage, and 2 ports of 100 gigabit per second networking. From our previous work, we know that the processors on this card are underpowered for most computational tasks. However, NVIDIA's roadmap indicates improvements are coming next year with the BlueField 3. We are also particularly interested in the BlueField 4, which may include accelerator hardware derived from NVIDIA's GPU products. Given the capabilities of emerging SmartNICs, the goal of our work is to adapt our HPC software stack to allow data management and storage services to be offloaded to the network's edge. We have 4 long-term objectives in this project. First, we'd like to reduce the number of compute nodes required to implement data management services in the platform by using SmartNICs to host objects. Second, we'd like to improve the rate at which simulations can publish objects by exploiting the proximity of the SmartNIC to the host application. Third, we'd also like to provide an environment for executing computations on in-transit objects. These computations do not necessarily need to be optimal, they simply need to complete before the next wave of data arrives at the SmartNIC. And then finally, we'd like to construct indexing surfaces that allow users to perform queries on a distributed collection of SmartNICs. Next, I'd like to focus on the process of adapting data management services to SmartNICs. While there are multiple data management libraries available for HPC, Sandia uses a library named Fayadel for routing objects between different workflow jobs. Fayadel uses safe remote DMA primitives to move objects between applications and memory pools that are hosted in different locations in the platform. As illustrated at the bottom of the slide, one of Fayadel's strengths is that it supports a variety of hosting scenarios. In the first example, a simulation job uses Fayadel to simply read and write data stored in a file system or a persistent object store. Second, a workflow can launch a collection of nodes to serve as an external memory pool for hosting objects. This approach decouples producers and consumers and allows data objects to remain in memory. Third, memory pools can also be hosted within the ranks of the simulation. This approach is useful in scenarios where consumers only need a small portion of the simulation data and is more efficient to leave the objects in place on the producers than to publish them out to external nodes. And finally, SmartNICs provide us with a fourth option where simulation nodes publish objects to the local SmartNIC. This approach allows us to store data in close proximity to the simulation ranks, but still in memory that's external to the application. Our team adapted Fayadel so that it can run on both hosts and BlueField SmartNICs. This work was relatively straightforward because we did not have to make conceptual changes to Fayadel. The ARM processors on the BlueField card run a self-contained version of Linux and are presented as just another compute node in the network fabric that applications can reach through normal network operations. Fayadel's pool abstractions allow any endpoint to participate in one or more pool. Therefore, users simply need to add the BlueField nodes to a runtime configuration to use them for hosting data. One of the challenges of adapting Fayadel to the BlueField processors was that we had to transition from x86 to ARM processors. While Fayadel is all written in portable C++, it uses libraries such as tcmalloc, which have moderate amounts of assembly. Fortunately, we had previously resolved these architectural conflicts when Fayadel was used in an ARM HPC system. The BlueField modifications mark the first time that Fayadel has run in a mixed environment that features both x86 and ARM processors. After porting Fayadel to run on the BlueField SmartNICs, we conducted a number of experiments to learn more about the performance trade-offs when working in a mixed hardware environment. The first set of experiments we conducted measured how fast a host application could push objects to its local SmartNIC. We created a synthetic application that uses multiple producer threads on the host to generate and publish a collection of objects to the SmartNIC at the same time. We varied both the size of the objects and the number of threads used on the host and SmartNIC. Performance is reported in terms of aggregate bandwidth transferred from the application's perspective and includes memory allocation, data copies, network transfers, and acknowledgement of receipt. The plot on the left shows the impact of object size on performance for a fixed number of threads. As you'd expect, larger objects enable the hardware to achieve better efficiency. The plot on the right shows the impact of running multiple threads on both the host and the SmartNIC. These weak scaling numbers confirm that performance improves when more transactions are in flight at the same time and the SmartNIC has multiple threads to process the data. It is important to note that the scale on the bandwidth axis only goes up to 6 gigabytes per second, while the underlying network is capable of double that bandwidth. While some of this performance loss can be attributed to the performance limitations of the ARM processors, we believe that most of this drop is due to the fact that Feodal is not taking advantage of locality in these transfers. We are currently investigating ways to improve the rate at which we can transfer data to the local card. The initial results from the injection tests motivated us to conduct additional experiments and learn more about how data management tasks are impacted by the embedded processors found on the SmartNIC. Taking inspiration from the StressNG benchmark, we constructed a new tool called Feodal Stress that extracts a number of core functions from Feodal and measures how many operations per second can be performed as we scale the number of worker threads. Feodal Stress includes a variety of common data management tasks, such as generating and sorting keys, allocating network accessible memory, and manipulating in-memory hash maps. We ran Feodal Stress on a variety of HPC platforms to see how well the Bluefield processors performed compared to other HPC platforms. As listed at the bottom, these processors include general-purpose x86 cores from AMD and Intel, the Intel Knights Landing processor found in the Cray XC40, and the server-class ARM ThunderX2 processors available in Sandia's Stria compute platform. For this talk, we'll focus on two Feodal Stress examples: data serialization and local in-memory key blob data structure manipulation. The first Feodal stress test focuses on serialization challenges. Serialization is the process by which we convert a user's in-memory data structures into a contiguous memory buffer so that we can transport the data over the network using efficient RDMA commands. Being able to unpack, analyze, and repack data is a critical function for Eusocial work. While libraries such as Apache Arrow have streamlined this process for tabular data, the HPC community largely serializes unstructured scientific data by hand or through C++ libraries such as Boost or Serial. The serialization test uses multiple methods to serialize data structures that are similar to those found in HPC simulations. The particle bundle version of this test uses a struct of arrays approach to housing the different component values for particles in separate arrays. In these tests, we both serialize and deserialize data to capture both ends of the processing overhead. The plot at the bottom of the slide shows how aggregate serialization performance varies as we scale the number of worker threads on different processors. From this plot, we see there is a clear performance separation between the x86 servers and other processors such as the ARM ThunderX2 and the Knights Landing processors. While the Bluefield ARMs are in the bottom of this list, it's worth noting that the Bluefield 2 is similar to other processors at lower thread counts. The second set of Feodal stress tests that I want to talk about today examine how quickly threads can interact with an in-memory key blob data structure. These data structures are a critical part of data management services and provide both a hash map to store objects and the scaffolding by which we perform event-driven operations in Feodal. In this test, workers perform put, get, and drop operations in rapid succession and use key names that are deliberately picked to either create or avoid contention. In the first plot, we see that all systems drop in performance after a few threads when a user picks key names that lead to hotspots. In contrast, the second plot shows the increase in performance that takes place when a user picks key names that avoid contention. In this test, we see that the Bluefield 2 NICs actually outperformed the ThunderX2 and Knights Landing processors. Looking closer at the results of the previous slide reveals some hard truths about HPC architecture. When designing new platforms, system architects focus on maximizing simulation performance. In most cases, this drives the need to get as many floating point units in a chip as possible. General purpose processors such as the KNL and ThunderX2 follow a strategy of packing as many cores into a chip as possible, even if it means individual core performance is slower. GPUs are the extreme case for this scenario. The issue for people writing data management services is that our tasks generally do not have the right kind of parallelism to exploit these processors. As the HPC community continues farther down this path, we should expect data management bookkeeping services will have less room to work in future architectures. As such, I believe it's useful to include different processors in the platform. This allows us to pick computer-optimized processors for the simulation and an embedded processor for coordinating our asynchronous network operations. To summarize, SmartNICs are appealing for HPC data management services because they offer a cost-effective way to offload in-memory object hosting. We've demonstrated in this work that we can use them with existing communication libraries such as Fayetteville. Now, we do note that current hardware has limited computational performance, and this does affect our network throughput, as well as limit the types of operations that can be performed on in-transit data. However, we also note that current generation data parallel processors found in HPC systems also have similar problems. We expect that next year's Bluefield 3 hardware will address some of our performance issues. Now, looking ahead, we see that there are a number of tasks for us in upcoming work. First, we'll be performing some optimizations to improve our host-to-card injection times by leveraging the locality of the SmartNICs to the host processors. Second, we'll be exploring Fayetteville's new remote computing operations API to allow us to implement user-defined functions that can process in-transit data. And then last, we'll be exploring how to leverage Apache Arrow to store and process tabular data in the SmartNICs. Thanks.
Thanks so much for Craig for the great talk. Actually, I worked with him since last year on the SmartNIC project, and many thanks to him. The same thing actually for Phillips, and both of them, Phillips and Craig, I've been working with him for a long time, and we actually produced some very useful results for publication. Just want to say thank you. So any questions from the audience?
Yeah, Craig, how does cost actually figure into this? I mean, you guys, performance is key, I expect, for you guys, but there is some aspect of cost that fits into this. How do you evaluate that, or are you even looking at that right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, when you look at the cost of the SmartNICs, the current values of these things, usually we'll pay about, expect about $1,000 for an HPC NIC, maybe $1,200 for that. And if you get a SmartNIC, if you the same version of the card but with SmartNIC capabilities, might be around $2,000. So it is doubling in cost. So it is noticeable. But at the same time, when we buy nodes, we're talking about pretty expensive hardware. So with a GPU card being around $10K, and packing a bunch of those in, that kind of drives it down. So if it means that we're if it's already in line with the compute node, and it's just an extension, and that everything already we already need an HPC NIC for this kind of stuff, and if it just happens to have some extra boost inside of it, then it kind of there's a good case for that. And we just actually are procuring a system that will do this right now, just at a 100 node count right now. So,
Thank you.
Hi, Craig. This is Paul von Stanwitz. In addition to performance, is there an issue with the limited amount of memory on these cards in some applications?
yeah, absolutely. That would be one of our complaints as well, is that, well, first of all, I guess 32 gigs is not that bad for an embedded card. I mean, it's a decent size, but you would have to factor in the scaling of what the node is and how much data is typically being dumped out in a single time step. And at the moment, we're probably at like 256 gigs for host memory. So there's probably some multiplier that we would have to figure out of what the right size of what we really want. But it's a combination of things. If there was more memory, or if there was non-volatile memory, like NVMe devices built onto it, which some of the cards have. There might be a nice trade-off there, or persistent memory. That would be another option for us. But one problem is that the SmartNICs are it's a niche market, so you don't get too much say in what they're producing, and they just have a few models of these things.
Yeah, we've seen that, trying to match it to, let's say, applications it's like sometimes assume a certain amount of memory per node. And so if you're using this as a sort of a data management node, then it would be nice to match what the application is assuming. But oftentimes that doesn't happen if it's down to 32 gig. So. Yeah,
and to be fair, like the applications usually they don't write out their entire memory space every time step. The developers already are familiar with down selecting just to the bare minimum of things that they would want to save out that they could reconstruct later. So they're already slimming it down to a manageable size. So there's probably it's a little easier than the worrying. It doesn't need to be a one-to-one kind of mapping. It can definitely be much smaller than what the host would have.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I have a question. And since you mentioned the Apache Arrow for the SmartNIC use case, I wonder how hard it would be to convert the simulation results to the Apache Arrow data format, and what is the challenge for that? Because in generic DMA, the generic things, people may use some kind of format for genes data, and they kind of not willing to move to a different format. And is it the same case in the simulation, the HPC workload?
Yeah, there's similar problems, right? Apache Arrow, it's tabular data, so it's great for some things, but it's maybe not appropriate for others. For example, it's probably not a good idea to store images in Apache Arrow, right? Because it's a big two-dimensional thing of stuff, and so a lot of our data is mesh data sets, for example, where it's a complex structure with vectors that are extremely long. But on the other hand, we do have other data sets like this particle data set, which has it looks more like tabular. It's got thousands of or billions of particles, and each one is an XYZ plus vector kind of thing that possibly could fit inside of an arrow table. The hard thing though is like convincing application developers that they should make that change, right? The big data side, that's already happened, and it really helps out, and things move faster in that space for developers. But when people have been building these, optimized for compute kind of data structures, it is a big ask to have them, try something different or restructure them into something if there's not a clear, path for them leveraging it downstream for the analytics.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
No questions. So if there is no questions, let's move to the last speaker, which is me. I didn't do much introduction for myself, and actually a PhD candidate, uses and Cruz, everybody knows, and here. I'm a student of supervision under Professor Carlson, and my talk is mostly about the SmartNICs performance characterization, and also about some of my envision about what we can do with the SmartNIC for data management. Good morning, I'm Jianshen Liu. I'm happy to present my recent research work on the use of SmartNICs, or DBU, for offloading data management services in the context of high-performance computing. My advisor is Carlos Mawson, and this is a collaborative work with Craig and Matthew from Sandia National Labs. Moving functions to specialized embedded hardware has been one of the main approaches to improve the performance of user applications or workloads because of reducing data movement. In high-performance computing simulation and analytics workloads,
we have identified data management and storage services running on compute nodes will hurt the workload's performance. Because these services are used by multiple parallelly running workloads, and they take CPU and memory resources of the host to ship resulting data between hosts along the pipeline. As you can see in the figure on the bottom left corner, some workloads may even have separated compute and I/O phases. And therefore, lowering the host's resource requirements for data management services is critical for the performance of HPC workloads. SmartNIC is one of hardware that gains embedded computing resources and has received increased research interest in recent years. We look at SmartNICs for accelerating HPC workloads because we believe we can leverage SmartNICs' specialized capability to conduct out-of-band data management services on behalf of the host. The BlueField-2 DPU was released early this year from Mellanox, now NVIDIA, and the next generation is claimed to have 10 times performance improvement. In this project, we now focus on the BlueField-2 SmartNIC since it is accessible and available to us through the Cloud Lab platform. This SmartNIC has a maximum bandwidth of 100 gigabit per second. It has 8 ARM CPU cores running at 2.5 GHz. It also has 16 gigabytes of memory, with an Ubuntu running on this card. Given the goal is to offload data management services to SmartNICs, it is essential to characterize the performance of the BlueField-2 card. In this presentation, I will start with the network performance of this card, followed by evaluating how does it perform on typical tabular data processing workloads with Ceph and Apache Arrow. And you're going to see a lot of data in this presentation. Then I will present where we are heading in trying to implement an LSN tree-based tabular data processing pipeline for SmartNIC. Finally, I will conclude with our future work. For network performance, I will cover 3 protocols: the kernel IP protocol, RDMA, and DBDK. This slide shows the packet ejection throughput from the ARM environment of the card. I compared this throughput with the throughput of ejecting from the host. We used the Linux package generator for this test because it can generate packets within the kernel and avoid the overhead of context switching. We see that the performance of this package generator was roughly 15% higher than user-space generators such as iPerf and NetTCP. In this test, the BlueField-2 card can only saturate 60% of the total bandwidth, even with 4 CPU cores and a large packet size of 10 kilobytes. On the contrary, the host can saturate with only 5 CPU cores with the packet size of 832 bytes. This means the traditional kernel IP protocol is not efficient and too expensive to be used by the BlueField-2 card for network communication. We also conducted a general operations performance evaluation using the stress entry utility. The UDP stressor test shows the UDP network performance of this card using the kernel IP protocol is even worse than a 12-year-old general purpose server. On the other hand, if you look at the RDMA performance, a single ARM core can already saturate the 100 GB per second bandwidth with a relatively small message size, 4 kilobytes, which is much more efficient than the kernel IP protocol. This makes RDMA an attractive solution to leverage the platform bandwidth while still having enough remained computing resources on the card for accommodating data management processing. Now, DBDK is a user-space network solution. On this BlueField-2 card, DBDK can achieve the same performance as RDMA and performs even better in the cases with small packet sizes. It can saturate the bandwidth with the size of packets as small as 1 kilobyte. This result makes DBDK another attractive solution for efficiently dealing with the network traffic in embedded environments. You will also see later in this presentation, I will demonstrate the performance of DBDK to transfer Apache Arrow data. Ceph is a good model to distribute processing onto multiple nodes. An expectation we had previously is to offload some simple data management or analytics processing tasks onto SmartNICs using Ceph. However, based on the benchmark for general operations performance I did previously, Ceph server daemons such as OSD daemons are too heavy to run on the Profile 2 card. Now the problem is, if server daemons are not feasible, can we use the card as a Ceph client? Since Apache Arrow is a popular software already being used in many data analytics projects, we also used Arrow in our evaluation. The test infrastructure is shown in the upper right figure. We used two R7525 hosts from Cloud Lab. Each host has a Profile 2 card. For figures starting from next slides, the label R7525 to local Profile 2 means the communication is between a host and its local Profile 2 card, while the label R7525 to remote Profile 2 means the communication is between a host and a remote Profile 2 card. The R7525 host has more than 100 CPU cores and 512 gigabytes of memory. In the following experiments, whenever Ceph is involved, the Ceph server daemons are always running on an R7525 host, and OSDs are running on ManStore. I will compare the object accessing performance from a local Profile 2 card, a remote Profile 2 card, and from the host. Let's get started with running Rados Bench on the Profile 2 card. The two figures on the left show the throughput, and the two figures on the right show the CPU utilization at the throughput. The upper left figure shows the throughput of running Rados Bench on the local Profile 2 card using the kernel TCP or RDMA protocol to test the object sequential read and write performance. When testing using the kernel TCP, the maximum throughput with a single instance of Rados Bench is less than 1 GB per second, which is far lower than the next available bandwidth. The bottom left figure shows the throughput of running Rados Bench on a host. Comparing the Profile 2 card's read throughput to the read throughput of the host, the Profile 2 card can only achieve roughly 20% of the host's performance. While the throughput is low, the CPU utilization on the Profile 2 card at the throughput is already 50%. Running Rados Bench over RDMA performs better, but just slightly. What's worse, we believe the Ceph RDMA messenger is mainly for test and has not been widely used in deployment, because we found that it does not work for remote access when the object size exceeds a certain threshold. We expect that the next version of Ceph will fix the RDMA messenger problem by integrating the C* component. But until then, the network overhead of accessing Ceph objects from Profile 2 card is way too heavy. With this data, we also found that regarding the performance degradation on the card based on the performance of the host, the write performance degradation on the Profile 2 card is noticeably smaller than the read performance degradation. And I will have further analysis on comparing the overhead of performing reads and write operations. CephFS is another Ceph client which is also running on top of librados. Though we expect that it will not perform well on the Profile 2 card, but we want to see how will it look like when we use it to run tablet data processing workloads. This time we put Parquet files on the CephFS and used a patch arrow to read it with different selectivity. For the two figures on the first row, the bars shows the time taken to perform the selective reads, and the lines show the CPU utilization during the read. If we compare the read time of accessing the data from the local preview card with the time of accessing from the host, the local preview card is 8 times slower than the host. Even though, when looking at the CPU utilization, the preview 2 card's utilization value is 10 times of the host's utilization value. In other words, the preview 2 card takes more than 60% of the CPU to perform a simple row-based selection, while it is still 8 times slower than the host if they are doing the same task. Increasing the row-based selectivity doesn't help to reduce the performance gap, nor if we make the Parquet file to be uncompressed so that the data decompression overhead is removed. The lower figure shows the performance of reading from Parquet and Arrow IPC files with different compression types into memory of either Arrow tables or Pandas data frame. This test is different from the two tests above because it does not use selectivity and therefore the data scanning code path is not involved. However, even with a light-weighted code path, the performance on the preview 2 card is still 3 to 6 times slower than the host's performance. We want to get down to see where comes the exact overhead. So we stripped out all Ceph components and performed everything locally by preloading the data files into the local page cache instead of storing on the CephFS main store. This time we see the performance gap rose to 10 times in the case with selectivity, regardless of whether the data in the Parquet files is compressed or not. And it maintains to be 3 to 6 times slower if selectivity is not used. These results told us that it is the CPU and memory performance of the card that causes the slowdown. More importantly, we see that the performance of reading without selectivity from page cache can be 360 times faster than reading from the CephFS on main store, meaning the overhead of CephFS reads is significantly high on the preview 2 card. Now let's take a look at the write operations and see how the performance gap between the preview 2 card's performance and the host's performance under these operations is different from the gap under the read operations. The upper left figure shows the time taken to write error record batches or Panda data frame with different compression encoding to either Parquet or Arrow IPC files on CephFS. We ran this same set of tasks on a host, a local preview 2 card, and a remote preview 2 card. The figure on the upper right shows the performance ratio of the preview 2 card's time consumption over the host's time consumption on the same task. Regardless of different encodings and file formats, we see a noticeably smaller performance gap between the host and the preview 2 card. We also want to evaluate the overhead of writing to CephFS, so we ran the same tests except that in each test, the data is written to a local IPC buffer instead of an IPC file on CephFS main store. This time we see that the gap is even reduced to 2 times in the case with no compression. Also, the trade-off between leveraging the memory or the CPU of the card in this type of workload is clear, because we see the performance gap increases when writing to compressed IPC buffers as shown in the first two cases, meaning it is better to use the memory than the CPU of the card in this type of workload. Finally, we observed that writing to IPC buffers is 10 times faster than writing to IPC files on ZFS main store. On this slide, I want to summarize what we have found from previous experiments. First, not only self-server daemons but also self-clients overhead is unaffordable on the Profile 2 card because we see a noticeable slowdown comparing with the host's performance while still taking a significant amount of CPU on the card just for data accessing. We will need more light-weighted solutions such as Ferdo, which is an object data exchange library already being used in HPC. Second, for tabular data processing workloads running on the Profile 2 card, the write operations overhead is noticeably less than the read operations overhead, which makes offloading writes a more profitable direction than offloading reads. More importantly, since writes can most of the time be asynchronized, offloading writes instead of reads can circumvent and possibly hide the overhead of executing the operations by low-power platforms. Third, since we see compression incurs significant overhead, it is better to leverage DRAM than the CPU of the card for offloaded operations. Therefore, the uncompressed Aero IPC format is an ideal format to work on the card. The figure on the right is a distilled comparison between the read and write operations overhead by breaking down a typical workflow that composes of starting with reading, then row-based selecting, and finally writing to an uncompressed Aero IPC string. The three columns on the left shows the time breakdowns for the operations performance on the Profile 2 cards under three different selectivity. And the three columns on the right shows the time breakdowns for the host. When reading with selecting, the performance gap between the Profile 2 cards and the host is 6 times. When reading without selecting, which is the case with the selectivity of 100%, the gap reduces to 3 times. This emphasizes selective reads have a much higher overhead than writes. Notice that this is already the best case for selective reads because we choose to read from uncompressed IPC data, and the reading process is essentially zero copy. Now let's move to discuss where we are heading based on our findings. We want to implement a tabular data processing pipeline for SmartNICs with the idea of making use of tabular data writes, the scatter-gather capability of the NIC, and the LSN3 data structure. Making use of tabular data writes instead of reads is the conclusion from the previous experiments. The scatter-gather capability has been widely supported in modern NICs to allow simultaneously DMA multiple memory buffers to the NIC's memory with only one transaction. Some NICs, such as the Profile 2 DPU that we used in our experiments, even support talking to the DMA with I/O virtual addresses and let the I/O MMU handle the address translation. Most importantly, we want to leverage the LSN3 data structure because it is designed to optimize writes, and during the compaction process, data can be gradually optimized for reading. We based on the idea from Holly Castelletto's work on Ceph to embed the tabular data transformation from write-optimized format to read-optimized format into a distributed compaction process that involves multiple nodes. But here, we want to leverage the SmartNIC's capability to handle simple transformation operations and let the traditional host to handle complex operations by pushing back. Let's talk about the details. Along with the data analytics pipeline, assuming the HPC compute node generates tabular data, which has been serialized to error record batch streams and sent to the local SmartNIC. Here, for key value pair in the LSN3, we define the key as a row identifier in the tabular data, and the value as a tuple of column values in that row. Then a sorted run is record batches ordered by key. To start the transformation, a SmartNIC at whatever level can choose to either slice columns or rows based on configuration, and distribute results to the SmartNICs at the next level. For example, the local SmartNIC can dispatch different ranges of columns to different SmartNICs with gathering. Column-based slicing requires significantly less computing than row-based selection, and I will explain further on the next slide. On receipt, the next level SmartNICs can use scatter to fetch the received data into contiguous buffers for further processing without requiring memory copying. If in some cases the row-based slicing is needed to separate the key space of record batches and distribute them to multiple SmartNICs at the next level, the SmartNIC can independently slice rows and serialize each row groups for transferring without relying on the host, unless complex operations are needed. In this way, we can construct an LSN tree-based tabular data processing pipeline for converting data from write-optimized format to read-optimized format. With the Arrow IPC data format, we can use the most efficient way to implement this transformation pipeline. Suppose the host generates an Arrow record batch, which now has been serialized into a contiguous memory buffer in Arrow IPC format. This format contains metadata to point to the offset and length of each data column in the buffer, so that SmartNICs can make use of this information and gather multiple column buffers with less number of DMA transactions for data transfer. The transferring can run on any transport protocol that supports scatter-gather, such as RDMA and DPDK. The receiver SmartNIC can then scatter the received column buffers to a virtually contiguous Arrow IPC buffer resided in the receiver program's processor memory on the ARM subsystem of the card. If key space slicing for rows is needed in the current IPC buffer, we can first zero-copy the serialized IPC buffer into an Arrow record batch, and then perform zero-copy slicing on this record batch into multiple batches before ejecting to the network. Note that I'm talking about row slicing, which is a light-weighted operation in Arrow, and not row-based selection, which can incur significant overhead on the Bluefield 2 card. To start with all these transformations, it is important to have an efficient way to pass Arrow record batches or a subset of a batch to and from the SmartNIC over the network. However, the only current solution in Arrow, called ArrowFlight, which is based on gRPC, does not perform well. Therefore, I propose an Arrow native messenger for faster data transport, which aims to be significantly faster than the current implementation of ArrowFlight. This messenger will use DPDK or RDMA as the transport and leverage capabilities of the SmartNICs, including scatter-gather and possibly the compression, decompression hardware engines available in some SmartNICs, for example, the Bluefield 2 SmartNIC. I've created a demonstration to use gathering to send record batches and compare the throughput of sending to a local Bluefield 2 card with the throughput of sending to another host. In DPDK, gathering memory buffers to the next memory can be implemented by attaching virtual memory to segments of Ethernet packets as shown in the bottom left figure. An Ethernet packet can contain multiple segments. The first segment stores the packet header information, for example, Ethernet header, IP header, and TCP or UDP header, and some other preference flags for offloading some operations to the NIC. Then the following segments can point to a piece of memory in the serialized record batch buffer, then finally update the descriptors to start a DMA transaction. There is a lot of detail that I don't have time to cover in this presentation, and you can refer to the links to the source code that I provided at the end of the slides. But overall, the result is stunning. With 1 core to send and 1 core to receive, we achieved 10 times performance improvement over the error flight in the case of using the local SmartNIC as the receiver. Also, the throughput of the ARM case is almost catching up with the host case, even though a single ARM core on the BlueField-2 SmartNIC is much weaker than the host Seagate core. I would say this is just the DBDK's performance, and RDMA is definitely another option for transferring record batches. We'll need more experiments to evaluate which one is better in what kinds of workloads. Finally, please allow me to summarize my future work. I'm planning to implement an error-native messenger for faster data transport using DBDK or RDMA. This messenger will be implemented as a library so that it can be used as an alternative to the gRPC transport in the current error flight, or to be integrated into some other pipelines if error flight is not needed. Once the messenger is in place, we can continue our efforts to implement the LSN3-based tabular data processing pipeline for SmartNICs. I'll let you know the performance next time. Thanks so much for listening to my presentation. Let me know any questions if you have.
All right. Is there any questions for me for the presentation? Sorry that the presentation is a little bit lengthy, and try to say a little bit slower so that you can know what I'm talking about.
I thought it was an excellent presentation.
Yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to add that we had originally planned that Holly Castelletto was going to give a presentation on Monday, but unfortunately that didn't come through. So Jianshen in this pre-recorded version was actually assuming that people would have seen that presentation on Monday. But he also explained, I think, pretty well what we think about LSM, the role of LSM in this particular project.
Hey, Jianshen, I had a question for you. Have you looked at, as you were talking about the write experiments, I was wondering what you might think the maximum rate at which a host could stream, or to write out Apache Arrow data to a Ceph file system. Do you have any sense of what like the maximum rate might be
without using Ceph?
Well, I guess I'm looking for any top level performance, right? If these are 100 gigabit NICs,
Yeah.
and trying to figure out where the bottleneck is in the best case, right? Of everything lined up and just streaming away through 100 gig, to your ideal Ceph cluster or anything on the back end. I'm just wondering what the maximum rate that somebody could get out of one of these.
I think so. In the DBDK thing demonstration, I just use 1 core. But if I'm going to use 2 cores on the host and 2 cores on the SmartNIC, and I assume I can get the maximum bandwidth to write the record batch to the SmartNIC.
Okay, and your Rados numbers were, I think you said something like 4 gigabytes per second for the host to write to Ceph. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so that by itself is still, if it's a 12 gigabyte per second link for 100 gig, that's still fairly, it's less than halfway point.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. And have you looked at any other file systems, you know, like Deos or just?
Not yet, but
Okay.
would be an interesting thing to look at.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of file system there we haven't tried yet.
Yeah, and I expect that Deos is probably much faster, right? They're really they were actually designed for write performance in HPC environments.
Yeah, and you know that's been my question for a while is you know what's given the hardware changes that we're seeing with faster NICs and also NVMe and you know persistent memory and all that, what's the performance solution as opposed to sort of the capacity solution? Well, actually, I want it both, but you know, not pay a lot of money.
Like we
for it.
all.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I think we are at the time of for the ending of the workshop. And thanks everyone for attending this Eusocial workshop. And thanks for the talks and thanks for the questions. And Carlos, do you want to say any last words?
No, great job. Thank you, Jianshen, for sharing this session. And I just wanted to say that, you know, I posted the recordings of the individual talks on the webpage, on the agenda, and then also the slides. There's also going to be a recording of the whole session eventually on the agenda. I noticed that I got like some kind of notice that Seagate doesn't allow to share your slides or your recording, Philip. I'm not sure whether that's a setting or whether it's going to cause problems, but might, you know, if I hear that somebody can't actually access your slides, I'll let you know.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you should be. Let me double check all that, and then. But I think maybe we can just make a copy. You can make a copy of it,
Okay.
and then it will go away.
All
But
right.
let me double check with my manager. Get an email saying, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
See you in the main plenary session in a few minutes, in 10:40.
Bye-bye.